So thank you again for coming. As you know, as I said before, I'm Virginia Howlett, Chair of Women Together at St. Paul's. And the theme for Women Together is being a Christian woman in a diverse world. During this series, we explore ways to deepen our faith as we interact with the rest of the world. And we're happy to be able to share this journey with you. Special welcome to women attending for the first time. There are 7 meetings a year on the first Thursday of the month from October to May. You can go to the Women Together webpage on the stpaulcathedral.org website for more information. Women Together isn't something you join. You watch for publicity and you sign up by the Monday prior to the meeting so that we can figure out how many places to set, and then you come on the Thursday night. We have one more meeting this season in May, the first Thursday of May. I want to say thank you so much, especially tonight, to all the volunteers and the cathedral staff, amazing staff, who make this event possible. We're especially grateful that we're meeting in person, yay, and having a meal together, yay. For the first time in 2 years. And we have, ironically, our speaker, our very last in-person with the meal speaker was Mara Giles Watson in March of 2020, and she's here. She came back for our first meeting together, which I'm just thrilled about. Thank you especially to Betsy Montel, working hard over there, who has done amazing jobs with the food, and Cindy, and who's coordinating all the volunteers, and everyone at the cathedral, especially our amazing Bob Osley. So we're grateful to all of you. Just a quick note, our speaker will take questions at the end of her talk, so please save all your comments and questions to the end. Tonight, we welcome Rabbi Lenore Bohm. Rabbi Bohm was one of the first 50 women ordained as rabbis. Most of her career has been in San Diego, working with congregations and Jewish nonprofit organizations. In her rabbinate, in her rabbinate, which always sounds funny to me, in her rabbinate, she has always prioritized women's voices and interfaith efforts. Torah Tutor is her first, but she says not her last book. She's very happy to return to St. Paul's in this season of birth and rebirth. So please welcome Rabbi Lenore Bohm.
Thank you, Virginia, and I want to give a shout out to 3 dear friends who are here, Jane Vaya, Sharon Peterson, and Pat Lindquist. It's always nice to see friendly faces in the crowd. Well, that didn't start. That's the last slide. Okay. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shehechianu v'kiyamanu v'hikianu lazman hazeh. We thank you, the one beyond naming, inclusive of all names, Spirit of the world, for giving us life, for sustaining us, and for allowing us to be present together in this time and place. Virginia told me that this is the first time in 2 years that Women Together has met for a meal in person, so I wanted to begin my remarks with a blessing for new beginnings, first-time events, and events that warrant appreciation each time they occur, even when it's monthly or yearly. So when we begin our Seder meal next week at the beginning of Passover, this will be said or chanted at the beginning of the meal. Blessings such as this are the building blocks of the Jewish prayer experience and also of our spiritual awareness. By saying a blessing, we pause to take note, to rein in and focus our awareness on this moment, this food, this experience. Tradition tells us that we as Jews need to say 100 blessings a day. Imagine. The first blessing is for opening our eyes in the morning, then for standing, then for moving, for washing and dressing, and forgive me for saying this while you're eating, there's even a blessing for going to the bathroom. Imagine. We say, "Blessed are you, God, for making our bodies with wisdom, for opening and closing our orifices as is necessary for us to function." You see then that Judaism is very much an embodied religion. We honor our bodies for what they enable us to do, and we honor them for housing our souls. There are earthy blessings, such as the so-called bathroom blessing I just mentioned, and there are plenty of lofty blessings as well. For example, there is a blessing for studying Torah, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. Not the first time someone begins to study it, when she or he is a child of 5, or a young person at the age of 13, or a young adult at 27, or a senior at the age of 69. Each time we dedicate our minds and energy to engage with the book that we call the Torah, we say the following blessing or a variation. There you see the Torah scrolls. And here's the blessing for studying the Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, eternal our God, source of oneness in the universe. You give us the opportunity to connect and study and grow through your sacred text. The book I spent the last few years writing is a resource for studying Torah. In the book, I shine a light on words, phrases, and verses in the Torah that are uplifting, disturbing, healing, or thought-provoking. Many of these words lend themselves to rich conversation and even richer contemplation, with the goal, I hope, of someone learning more about Judaism and or more about themselves. I wrote this book because I believe in the importance of learning about one's religion and oneself as an adult. Many people think religion is for children, make-believe stories that foster innocence and reliance. I believe religion needs to be experienced on an adult level so that it challenges us, prompting us to risk and dare, and reminding us how important it is, even beyond our childhood years, to wonder and be amazed. For most Jews, the most sacred part of our scripture is what we call the Torah. And there you see Torah scrolls. That might be how you most associate them. Scrolls written in ancient form on parchment and then housed in the synagogue. The Torah has 187 chapters, 5,852 verses in all. You may have heard that Torah means law. There are many laws in the Torah, but the word does not mean law. The word Torah shares the same root letters with teacher and parent. For those of us who love Torah, it functions as a loving parent and teacher. It is a guide and a home base to grow from. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks wrote of the Jewish attachment to the Torah, "I wonder if anyone has ever loved a book as much as we Jews love the Torah. We stand when it passes as if it were royalty. We dance with it as if it were a bride. If it is desecrated or destroyed, we bury it as we would a loved one or a friend." Throughout our prodigious history spanning centuries and continents, the Torah has been the homeland and the touchstone of the Jewish people. Reading, studying, discussing, and chanting it weekly, it has kept us anchored to God, our history, and each other. For 2,000 plus years, Jews around the world focus on the same Torah portion each week, poring over ancient and contemporary commentaries to be uplifted by what is aspirational. Verses such as, "And God created them, male and female, were created by God," and "Love the stranger," an admonition that appears 36 times in these 5 books, and "Do not rob or defraud or stand idly by your neighbor's pain." And we also wrestle with verses that are troubling, such as, "And Abraham took his son up the mountain to offer him as a sacrifice," and "A person with any physical defect may not function as a priest," and "You shall not tolerate a sorceress." We do not merely read or parrot the Torah. We poke and prod it, challenge it, wrestle meaning out of it. Highly observant Orthodox Jews have kept the Torah and Judaism alive from generation to generation. But neither the Torah nor Judaism belong exclusively to them. And it's imperative that non-Orthodox Jews, often called Reform, Progressive, or non-denominational, that we foster an authentic, loving relationship to Torah based on our cherished values and commitments. Reform, progressive, non-traditional Jews are not required to approach the Torah in an unquestioning manner. And for me, that's very good, because I like to question. The not-so-good news is that for many of these Jews, Reform, progressive, or non-traditional, and by the way, most of my family and friends are in this group, they find the Torah's language and stories so alienating and irrelevant, they avoid it entirely. So what's a person like me to do? The Torah is the foundational document of Judaism. We all agree on that. For me personally, Torah is my favorite word, but intellectual and spiritual honesty require that I also admit that I am sometimes embarrassed, or offended by the Torah's disturbing passages. My solution to this is not to reject the Torah, but rather to engage in a close, full examination of the text and to try to read it with fresh eyes, that is, on its own terms, and not interpreted by those who for centuries have overlaid it with their own religious, political, or social agenda placed on the text. Additionally, I have no problem with accepting and acknowledging that this document is of a particular time and place, not late 20th or early 20th century North America. What I have found is that the Torah's overarching mandates are justice, compassion, generosity, and responsibility. Although it is a patriarchal document, some women in the Torah have extraordinary influence. Many laws are designed to ensure societal care for the least fortunate and most disenfranchised. Individuals in the Torah are not holy, perfect, and whole. They struggle and grow just as we do. And when they recognize their lapses, as hopefully we do when we recognize ours, the best among them act to make things right. Here is one of my favorite expositions about what the Torah as a whole illuminates. This is by Cynthia Ozick. Some of you might be familiar with her. I can make no definitive statement about the source of being, but I can say what the source is not. I'm not going to fall for false gods, false ideas, because I am shaped by ethical monotheism, by the Torah. And I'm not going to be tempted or even fooled by an idol. You know an idol from miles away if you have been taught by Torah. You know how to make a distinction between reality and illusion, between the actual and the fraudulent. Judaism is training towards intellectual freedom. In my opinion, the Torah mandates intellectual freedom. It invites conversation, questions, and grappling. It does not coerce belief. To me, the first book of the Torah, Genesis, invites us to consider where we as human beings fit into the created world and how can we exercise creativity as does our Creator. Genesis is also about families, and through the stories of Genesis, we can reflect on our own families, on leaving home, on starting new families, on issues of forgiveness, on moral dilemmas, and spiritual growth. Exodus focuses on freedom and its responsibilities. These are questions of adolescence and young adulthood. Who do I choose to surround myself with? What will be my values and commitments? The third book of the Torah, Leviticus, is about covenantal relationships and building community. Leviticus also asks, when I do wrong, how do I set myself right? How do I re-enter communal life after sickness and contact with death? How do I give thanks? How do I experience the divine? Numbers is the fourth book of the Torah. It is filled with complaints and the Israelites' weariness. Among Jews, it's called the Book of Kvetching. Great Yiddish term. In some ways, the book of Numbers reminds me of parenting and work life. The same thing over and over. Will I ever get ahead? Is there an end in sight, or is it all pointless? What exactly is the point? What are my responsibilities to my community, to the vulnerable and disenfranchised? And finally, Deuteronomy, the fifth book of the Torah. What have I and what have I not achieved in my life? given my particular circumstances? Can I let go of life gracefully? What will be my legacy? So to me, the 5 books of the Torah parallel the life cycle from beginnings to endings. Regarding Torah study, a rabbi wrote, "It opens us up to the notion that there is something larger than ourselves in the universe. The more we learn, the more we feel there is to learn. We cannot know it all. We cannot control it all. This is a serious corrective to a contemporary culture that makes claims of being able to access every scrap of information. The internet confers the illusion that everything is knowable. Torah study is an exercise in humility." Another writer described our current way of getting information as an exercise in chipping away at our capacity for concentration and contemplation. To me, studying the weekly Torah portion encourages concentration and contemplation. Writing this book is my attempt to entice women, to entice people, particularly women, back to the Torah so that we can concentrate and contemplate and feel ourselves challenged and called. In Jewish life, this is what Torah study used to look like. Do you notice anything? This is also going on today and has been for the last 20, 30 years. I am trying with my book to get more women to sit around tables and talk about the stories we share. There is a well-known poem among Jewish feminists. It's called "We All Stood Together" by Merle Feld. It references a small few verses in the book of Exodus in which Moses explicitly speaks to the Israelite men, not to the women, telling them to listen to hear God's word in 3 days. God's word meaning revelation at Sinai or the giving of the 10 Commandments. So women are not seen as present there. Although they were at the bottom of the mountain, they weren't seen as being integral to what the Israelites were about to hear. What's also important for you to note in understanding this poem is that the Torah, written on the scrolls, is written in consonants only. There are no vowels, because that's what the Hebrew language used to be, consonants only. When people spoke it, they added the vowels, but it was written only with consonants. So there are books such as this. This is a woman's commentary, the first of its kind, but there are literally hundreds of commentary that don't say men's commentary, but that's what it is, written by men. This is entirely written by women. In these commentaries, which anyone can have and buy, and they're readily available at the synagogue, you have the entire Torah text that's in the Torah scroll, but with the vowels, so you learn how to say it. So I know that's a little confusing, but I hope you sort of get it. Okay, accompanying the poet references that the Torah is somehow incomplete because it's missing vowels. And she suggests that the vowels are women's voices. So here is the poem. My brother and I were at Sinai. He kept a journal of what he saw, of what he heard, of what it all meant to him. I wish I had a record of what happened to me there. It seems like every time I want to write, I can't. I'm always holding a baby. One of my own or one for a friend. Always holding a baby, so my hands are never free to write things down. And then as time passes, the particulars, the hard data, the who, what, when, where, why slip away from me. And all I'm left with is a feeling. a feeling of vowels like the barking of a mute. My brother is so sure of what he heard. After all, he's got a record of it, consonant after consonant after consonant. But if we could remember it together, it would be holy time, and the sparks would fly to the heavens. So my book is my small attempt to add vowels in the form of one woman's voice and many women's voices, which I include in the book, as vowels to the Torah text. I'm happy to answer any questions you have about my remarks and approach, and then I look forward to engaging in a little Torah study with you, which is on the handouts you have before you. Thank you. Pat. Well, the story of the truly first woman rabbi is very, very sad indeed. She was trained in Berlin in the 1930s, and she wasn't given a job at a congregation. She wasn't given a prestigious job. She worked in hospitals and with orphans, and she went to Auschwitz with her charges, the hospital patients and the orphans, and she continued to counsel as a rabbi in Auschwitz, and ultimately she was murdered. So she was truly the first woman rabbi, and her name was Regina Jonas, Jonas, and you can look her up to learn more about her. In this country, the first woman who applied to become a rabbi, her name is Sally Presand, and the president of the Reform Rabbinical Seminary sort of slipped her in to the school without the Board of Governors noticing. And he was a very renowned leader and archaeologist and had a lot of clout, and he could get away with something like that. So this goes to show we always need allies. Sally, who is a friend of mine, was honored last week for the 50th anniversary of her ordination. And she told, among many stories, that her classmates told her that at a meeting that she happened not to attend, it wasn't on purpose, she wasn't excluded, she wasn't there for whatever reason, and the 35 other male members of her class were there, and the professor said to them, so which one of you is going to marry Sally so that she'll get out of this program? So it was only because a few very brave men, including this Dr. Nelson Glick, thought that they could squeeze her in sort of unnoticed that she became the first rabbi. And everyone was kind of waiting to see what would happen. You know, would the sky fall? Alas, it didn't. And slowly they added more to each class, 2, 3, 4. By the time it was my class, there were 11. And women have made an enormous difference in the rabbinate, which I'm sure you sense in your own clergy, what a difference it is to have a female voice, a female presence, a female role model, female perspective. I hope that answers your question. Anything else? Yeah, it's a Lindquist night.
Just out of curiosity, how long did it take you to write the book, and if any, what challenges popped up for you during that time?
You know, I've been teaching this stuff for years. I've been a rabbi for 40 years. So I didn't always teach this stuff, but for a lot of the 40 years I did. So I had a lot of papers that I had to organize. As I was organizing my papers, I realized that what would make my book different one thing that would make it different is if I prioritize women's voices. Another, if I drew on commentaries that are less well known. So for example, there's a commentary by homosexual and lesbian rabbis called Torah Queries, Queeries. And I quoted them a number of times. And I also quoted some very traditional rabbis, some very left-wing radical rabbis. I really tried to include a lot of different voices. So although what I have been teaching for close to 40 years formed in a way the basis of the book, it really sent me out looking for things that were written primarily in the last 20 years and from younger rabbis and from different perspectives. It was a total joy to write it. So there was no challenge. The only challenges were getting permissions from some people and, I don't know, waiting for it to come out. Okay, so please indulge me. Let's do a little Torah study. This is the kind of thing that is in my book. So you should have those sheets before you. Nope, other way. Okay, so we're going to be looking at the story of Noah, but I want to begin with an introduction to Genesis. So this might be different from how you've thought about the book of Genesis before, or maybe you haven't thought of it as a book because in your liturgy, perhaps the selections are so random that you don't realize that we approach it as a book, but we do. In Genesis, we meet God. Many people don't believe in God, at least that's true among Jews. Maybe all Episcopalians do. Any chance of that? Yes, you do. You're not laughing. That means you do all believe. Okay. Many people don't believe in God and resist contemplating what God could mean. Reading Genesis, I experienced the Creator God and the God of relationships. The Genesis creation stories increase my sensitivity to the mystery of life, the organic connection between people and other living beings, and the prevalence of design and order in the universe. The Genesis characters display love, faith, and courage, along with, and let's be honest, selfishness, brutishness, and questionable motives. Let's be honest. All persons in Genesis are flawed, but these stories dramatize that people have the capacity for moral and spiritual growth. The narrative of Genesis plays out in the context of family connections, both fierce loyalty and consuming hatred, let's be honest, characterize kindred relations within this network. Genesis raises questions about human accountability. These timeless questions continue to vex us today. That's one of my favorite paragraphs in the book. Okay, so now we're going to look at Noah, and I decided to bring you the story of Noah because it's probably something that you're all familiar with, but perhaps you do what is done in many Jewish settings, which is teach the story of Noah as a children's story. And when I looked for pictures to include in this presentation, most of the pictures showed very happy animals on the ark. Okay. In the closing verses of the prior section, that's the section that leads up to Noah, God realizes that human beings cause seemingly insurmountable problems. People don't automatically obey God, think parent, and some of their actions result in violence, even murder. In the Noah story, God's angry response to a willful and savage humanity is to release a flood that destroys the world, except for one family and representatives of each animal species. Many people see this as a children's story, perhaps because of all the animals, but this is not a story for innocents. Honestly, if you read it, it terrifies. After the flood dissipates and the ark inhabitants return to dry land, are so happy. God sends a rainbow as a covenantal sign that God will not destroy the earth again, but Noah engages in destructive behavior. He becomes a drunkard. Perhaps he had PTSD, traumatized by what he witnessed. He is no longer described as righteous or walking with God, which is how he's introduced to us. He is a broken man. Okay, we'll get to that in a minute. Okay, so hopefully you have at the bottom of your sheet A, Genesis 6, 9 to 10. These are the words that are actually in the Torah, okay? This is a direct translation from the Hebrew. It says, "This is Noah's line. Noah was a righteous man in his generation. He walked with God. Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth." So I'd like to ask you, this is for a conversation about this. Noah is called righteous. What do you think defines a righteous person? Would anyone like to?
There's faith in God. I mean, to come up and say, there's going to be, you're going to have a flood, and even though you're in dry land, I mean, it's sort of like Abraham. So I think it says about Abraham that because of his faith, God counted him as righteous.
Okay, well, I'm going to disagree with you in a little while. I hope you don't mind. I appreciate that you raised your hand. What's your name? Barbara said that it's Abraham's faith in God, his trust in God, that makes him a righteous person. Anyone else? Yes? He does what he's told. Okay, yes. He does good. A righteous person is someone who does good deeds. One more any answer? Yes.
I would say someone who does good because they're attempting to be a better person in accordance with instruction.
Someone who does good in order to be a better person. Okay. So now for this, I'm going to ask you to just engage in a little conversation at your table. Who in your life is righteous? Would you describe anyone in your life as righteous? And if not, it's possible we all know wonderful, wonderful people. Righteous is a very high, elevated designation. But talk amongst yourselves for a minute or two. Do you know anyone who's righteous, and why do you think of them as righteous? Okay, 1 more minute, so if someone wants to speak, you should speak now. Okay, let me bring you back, but I'm delighted you had so much to say. There are some other questions on the top of the next page, on the back of that, but we're not going to look at it because I want to get through some other things. So we're going to go to B. Does everyone see letter B? Okay. So I'm going to read this, but at a certain time I'm going to say, read with me, because I want to draw attention to something. Okay, you ready? We're at B. God said to Noah, "The earth is full of violence. I'm going to wipe them off the earth. Make an ark, take 2 of each of every living creature together." And Noah did just as God had commanded. Stop. God said to Noah, it should say, "Go into the ark with your household. I will pour rain upon the earth for 40 days and nights and wipe out all that exists." Together, Noah did just as God. Okay, Torah commentator, one of the few highly, highly esteemed and prolific women Torah commentators, Aviva Gottlieb Zornberg, wrote this assessment of Noah in her book, Genesis, The Beginning of Desire. From the beginning to the end of the flood narrative, Noah says not a word. God talks to him twice before the flood, telling him of what is to come, telling him how to build the ark, to enter it with his family and representatives of the animal world. And after each of God's long speeches, the text tells us impassively together, and Noah. The impact of Noah's silent acquiescence in the destruction of the world is devastating. Makes you wonder about the term righteous. Did he save anyone but himself and his family? So we ask, what was the impact of Noah's silence and what were Noah's options? Would anyone like to suggest what an option could have been for him? Yes? Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't think the story precludes Noah saying to his neighbors, "Look, there's going to be a big flood, try to do something." So just to contrast him with Abraham, you might remember the story of Abraham arguing with God about Sodom and Gomorrah. God says to Abraham, "I'm going to destroy these cities." And what does Abraham do? "Excuse me, God, I'll bow many times before you. Would you mind saving it if there are 50 people?" God said, "Righteous people?" God says, "Yes, I'll save 50 righteous people." No, Abraham has doubts that there are 50. "Excuse me, God, I hope you don't mind my interrupting your feast, but would you save the cities if you find 45 righteous people?" "Yes, I will save for 45. And he continues to argue with God. So there is a model. Now, Abraham is after Noah, and that's precisely the point in the story of Genesis, is that we go from less aware of responsibility to more aware of responsibility. But I think Noah did have the option to tell some people. Okay, C. Everyone see C at the bottom? Again, this is directly from the Hebrew text. If you read it differently in some book or whatever, I respectfully say that they didn't follow the Hebrew. This is directly from the Hebrew. "Go then into the ark, you, your wife, your sons, and their wives." Noah, his sons, their wives, his wife, and their wives came into the ark. That very day, Noah and Shem and Ham and Japhet, Noah's sons, came to the ark with Noah's wife and his sons' 3 wives. God said to Noah, "Go out of the ark with your wife, your sons, and their wives." So Noah went out with his wife, his sons, and their wives. So we know Noah, and we know his sons' names, Shem, Ham, and Japhet. They repeated several times. Are any names missing? Have you ever noticed that before? So in I grew up with Mrs. Noah. That's who I grew up with, Mrs. Noah. She was plump, she was kindly, she loved animals, and she helped her husband and her family. Now, women approaching text, whatever text it is, have, in my opinion, a responsibility to say who is talking, who is listening, who is being listened to, who is named, who is unnamed, who has agency, who makes things happen, who is prevented from making things happen. All these are questions I think we are obligated to ask of the text. Now, it turns out, if you look in this lighter piece here, Genesis Rabbah, a collection of ancient rabbinical interpretations of Genesis, named Noah's wife Naamah, the daughter of Lamech and sister of Tubal-Cain. Naamah means pleasant. Why do you think that name was chosen? Here we have a book by a rabbi, one of the early rabbis, Sandy Eisenberg Sasser, 1974. This is how stories and perceptions change. People have a book that now have Noah's wife's name. Someone hearing Mrs. Noah will say, her name is Naamah. She has a name. And the name came from a long time ago, from the year 300 or 400. It's not a new name. It's not Tiffany. It's Naamah, and how wonderful. Okay, going down to D. Noah then built an altar to honor and thank the Eternal. We don't have time, but these are the kind of questions I ask in my book. How do you express gratitude when receiving someone's thanks? Do you appreciate the words and deeds equally? Do you prefer one to the other? Is your church the place where you feel most moved to thank God? Okay. E, Noah drank of the wine and grew drunk and exposed himself under his tent. Ham saw his father's nakedness and went outside to tell his two brothers. Shem and Japheth took a cloak and put it on both their shoulders. They walked backward and covered their father's nakedness. Facing backward, they did not see their father's nakedness. So now we come to some questions of morality and ethics. What makes a person want to shame or mock another? Ham was willing to shame and mock his father. What contributes to a person responding with empathy? Shem and Japheth responded with empathy. What makes a person choose these responses? How else could the sons have handled the situation? So, again, those are questions that are a little deeper, perhaps, than the early ones, but these are the kinds of questions I ask in my book. Introduction to this. Okay. Finally, I want to close by saying that it's impossible for me to do anything now, and maybe you feel the same, without feeling the presence of this horrendous situation in Ukraine, and to be talking, to be laughing, to be enjoying good food, to be returning to safe homes and warm beds, to have a hot meal. It almost becomes a guilty pleasure to me. And I didn't want to leave without drawing our attention to how broken our world is and how serious the issues are for so many people. And my friend Jane shared with me a beautiful poem that fits very, very well to be recited with this flag in our presence. So come on up here, Jane.
These are the words of a rabbi from, do you know what century?
Probably third or
3rd or 4th century. To me, these words sound utterly contemporary. But like Lenore, I can't sleep at night thinking about what's going on in our world. And so now I read this prayer every night before I go to sleep, and it does sometimes enable me to sleep. Let not the grief of the world burden your spirit. That cup is not yours to take, but neither are you free to cease your good works. Grieve not. Let not the wailing of the world block your hearing. It's not for you to heal the world. Listen for God's voice in the silence. Let not the dangers of the world end your joy, but neither may you cease loving all. Do justice, love mercy, walk humbly now. It is not for you to heal the world, but to carry on the work of God's love. Amen.
If there's another question, I'll take it. I brought some books if anyone is interested in purchasing them. It's what is charged on Amazon. It's $20 for the paperback and $28 for the hardback. I'm happy to sign it to you or to someone you'd like to give it to. If you don't have the money here or you're not sure and you may want to buy it on Amazon, I'm happy for you to let me know, and I'll send you an adhesive sticker. You tell me what you want me to write on it, and you can put the adhesive sticker in your book. Okay? So are there any more questions? Yes.
Just a technical one that I've always wondered, would the vowels be missing in ancient Hebrew?
Would
Would the vowels be missing?
yes, they are missing. Well, it's not that they're missing, they weren't invented.
So when someone then supplies vowels, how do you know that you're supplying the right one?
Okay, so I hope this makes sense. The question was about the vowels missing in ancient Hebrew. So if you were to see a document and it said THNKFY, and it was in context, you would realize that it says, I think of you. You would realize that in context. So you read that, think for ooh, or however you read it, but I know how to say it, I think of you. Eventually, those missing letters, the I and think, the O and of, the OU and you, were taken because they were heard, they were identified by different dots and dashes and put into the text. Does that make sense?
Which century would that have been done?
You know, I really should know that. I apologize. I mean, it was, the 9th century was the latest it could have been. It was sometime before the 9th century. It was probably the 6th, but yeah. Okay. Merle Feld, M as in Mary, E-R-L-E, Feld, F-E-L-D as in David. Okay, so I will stand over here in case anyone wants to purchase a book or say hello, but first, Virginia will speak.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Bohm. I don't know how to summarize how grateful I am. Between the depth of the content and your sense of humor, keeping us all engaged, and I personally can't wait to read the book. And I want to hear more of the connections because it relates so much to us, even as Episcopalians, those of us here who are from St. Paul's and from other religions. It's just so strong for us, and the way that you connected us to the women who were there, but not mentioned by name. So thank you. We're so grateful for you and for this wonderful talk. And so grateful to Jane, too, for that beautiful, beautiful prayer. I would love to get it from you and type it up, and I'll put it on our webpage, if possible, because I know there will be other people asking for that. So before our closing prayer, and we're a little early, which is good, we allowed more time for questions that I guess we didn't need yet. I'd like to remind you to fill out the evaluation form on your table when you have a chance. There's pens there, and bring them to this table when you're done, fold it up. Next month, on May 5th, our last event of the year, of the season, will be Reverend Canon Allison Thomas, who many of us know, who was subdean here at the cathedral for years, will be here to speak to us on seeing God anew. And I think it will be a really lovely talk. So, Reverend Canon Allison Thomas. And I have one more very important announcement. This is my second to last meeting as chair of Women Together at St. Paul's. This season is the end of my third year. And I am going to be stepping down after the May meeting as chair, though I'll be continuing on the committee of volunteers who run Women Together. And our new chair of Women Together at St. Paul, starting next fall, will be Kimberly Fernandez. So Kimberly, go ahead and stand up. You may know Kimberly as a member of the Cathedral chapter, as helping host many of our Zoom sessions when we were on Zoom the last 2 years, and for, in the past, being our wine person. Everyone loved going to talk to Kimberly and getting their glass of wine. So we're really pleased and excited that Kimberly is taking over leadership of Women Together next season. It's great. And thank you again to all the clergy and cathedral staff and amazing, wonderful volunteers who put this together so that we could have this lovely meal and this incredibly inspiring talk. So before I close, let us pray. Merciful God of peace, your word, spoken by the prophets, restores people's life and hope. Fill our hearts with the joy of your saving grace, that we may hold fast to your great goodness and proclaim your justice in all the world. Amen. So thank you. Stay and finish your meals, go back for dessert, and enjoy a conversation. Thank you so much for coming.